Well, as I mentioned last time, I want to move on now to a discussion of ideological possession, a concept that originated in the thought of psychologist Carl Jung. And this discussion may go on for a few weeks. Ideological possession as a concept is one that I need to untangle and really explain. And along the way, I'll have to explain some of the ideas of psychologist Carl Jung. But as a way of kind of getting into the subject of ideological possession, I wanted to take a few minutes to explain my own experience with it. I grew up in a Democratic household. I heard a great deal of derision launched towards Ronald Reagan. I didn't like Ronald Reagan. As I went to university, I took the occasion to read up on Ronald Reagan's adventures in Latin America and was pretty disgusted with that as well. But I generally just leaned left because that's the way that I was raised. But I did live in a big city with a lot of poor people, with poor race relations in a lot of ways. And I don't think I was mature enough to ask the question, well, if Democrats or liberals are so wise, why do we have this poverty all around us, and why is all this crime and poor race relations? Why haven't they fixed all that? Looking back, I was mostly negatively focused. I was negatively focused on Ronald Reagan. I was negatively focused on televangelists, and that kind of came out of the way that I was raised. I heard that stuff a lot. So then, though, I went to graduate school, and in graduate school, I got the experience of being schooled by several fairly conservative professors in political philosophy. Now, this didn't change my general liberal bent, but it was kind of incongruous because they had something great to teach and I was really interested in it. And I didn't really judge one way or the other. I just really got into the subject matter and I learned a lot of the classics of political philosophy. So much so that I have to tell you, it never occurred to me that gender really entered into what I was studying at all. For instance, I didn't sit down and contemplate that most of the thinkers that I studied, if not all, were male or anything like that. It was just, I've always been fascinated by theory. Theory has a life of its own. It's not, in my mind, it doesn't have much to do with gender. So I got out of grad school still fairly liberal, although knowing a lot of interesting, smart, capable, conservative people at the university there did make me have more respect for their position. And they took the time to talk to me a lot. I made friends with students who were conservatives, and I realized that they were people too, if I might say so. Some of my best friends were conservatives. Well, and then I got out of college, and I got my first job, and it was at a university that only wanted me to come for a 3-year contract, so it wasn't a tenure track job. It was out on the East Coast. Prior to getting that job, I had interviewed in a variety of places, so there were a couple of shocking moments in all this process. Many of the interviews were very weird that I had before getting this job. The faculty who interviewed me clearly expected something out of me that wasn't in my resume. And my resume was very straightforward. My dissertation was on this, and these are the subjects I'm interested in, and they happen to be classical political philosophy. And what was kind of astonishing was they would ask questions about things that I did not know anything about, namely feminist theory and things like that, and kind of tended to treat me and my what I had to offer with quite a bit of disregard. And when they really fathomed what I was interested in, the classics of political thought, sometimes they got downright angry and rude, and as though, gee, you should have told us ahead of time what you were interested in and what kind of research you did. And I'm thinking, why didn't you take a look at my resume? So as a young person just starting out, I felt kind of like I was getting hazed. I had one one experience in particular that was just absolutely horrendous. I got a call in the middle of the night from one of the faculty members saying, "You'd better change your tune." At this point, I was not I was not a self-identifying conservative, but I'll tell you what, that experience of sort of hazing led me to start rethinking my political positions, because they were clearly coming from the left, and I began to have the notion that, through this sort of personal insult that had happened to me, that I should I should not be a member of that club. Well, and then as far as the first job goes, as many of you, if not all of you, have experienced, once you get a job that pays anything at all, and as I recall, my starting salary was $28,000 or something like that, which wasn't a lot of money then. I could barely afford furniture for my little apartment that I got. But when you first get your starting salary, if you're in a job like this, you not only have your taxes come out, but also your benefits and everything. So, and the taxes alone are a lot. They're a huge chunk. With taxes and benefits, that's, federal, state taxes and Social Security and Medicare, plus the insurance that they took out, and retirement, certain little retirement amount came out. I had less than half of the check left. I think it was something like 45%. I was absolutely shocked. Now, here's the way my mind worked, because this place where I worked, it was near DC, and so I had driven in there and had visited DC, and I'd seen the same sort of scenes that I grew up with. Homeless people on the street, people looking like they are unemployed, just a lot of poverty and a sort of aimlessness or hopelessness about it. And I thought to myself, then I had this aha moment, or so I thought, right? Aha, what are all these taxes going for? My liberal priorities in my mind were ending poverty somehow, employing the unemployed, and providing better jobs for the underemployed and things like that, better education. And none of that was happening. And when I really thought about it, for all the promises that the Democratic Party had made over the years, things were pretty much the same, and yet I was paying a lot. It seemed like a lot. I could barely afford to live there. Anyway, I'm thinking, well, if we spent the money correctly, then certainly we could solve these problems. Anyway, these two experiences, I would call them both insults, in the sense that doctors talk about injuries as an insult. In other words, they came as a sort of sudden shock to the system that led me to reevaluate my political stance. And just like that, I went from being a liberal to a conservative. I started to read up on conservative theory. In particular, I read up on black conservatives like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, because I had this notion, and there used to be a magazine that they put out. I had this notion that the people who I could believe the most were people from the African American community who had seen some value in this new ideology that I had previously disregarded. And they were saying things that sounded good. They sounded like they were concerned for the poor, that they wanted to eliminate racism by creating an economic environment where black people could get ahead and where people could be on an even footing. They reasoned that lowering taxes would create more jobs, which seemed to make sense to me. I had come from a town where we had a lot of farm implement industry and the railroad and things like that, but those industries had kind of crumbled, and there were a lot of reasons for that, but I didn't really know those reasons, and this made sense. If companies keep more of their own money, they will invest in their business, and they will grow, and this will employ more people. They talked about welfare system being kind of like a form of slavery, and the notion that in a way this system benefited the Democratic Party, because it locked people in, so that they had to support the party to continue to get their benefits, whereas Republicans promised to end welfare dependency, which, in other words, to free people. And in general, they extolled competition, which would make everything better, including education. Well, previously I had grown up in a system where the education was just downright terrible, I have to tell you. And so the idea that somebody might have a clue as to how to make education better, to make the schools better, really, really appealed to me. So I got really enthused. And here's the interesting thing. I forgot what I previously saw that was correct. Remember, I learned all about the Reagan administration's meddling in Latin American politics, and how that had gone seriously wrong, and hadn't ended up really doing much good certainly for the countries in Latin America. I really just kind of forgot that I disliked Reagan. I think part of what happened then was that, these people had some pretty good criticisms of the Democrats' performance. They hadn't been able to solve a lot of problems, that they had presided over a certain amount of bureaucratic bloat, that they did maybe think the debt was too acceptable, and that, yeah, they may have taken black people as a constituency and other groups for granted, and really kind of looked down their nose at them. I remember looking down my nose at conservatives when I was a liberal. There's a certain type of liberal that wants to feel pretty superior to other people, and sometimes I felt that way before. Now everything changed, and I had this different worldview. Now notice also that my core values kind of remained the same. I was concerned about the same subjects, but here came another party that criticized and made clear what was wrong with the other side, and then sold this idea or ideology, where everything was pretty neat and tidy. If you look at the ideology that was formed around the ideas of Milton Friedman and Reagan and Thatcher in that era, it's pretty libertarian, and it's pretty cut and dried. There's an answer for almost everything. And the idea is, if you really allow the free market to be completely free, everything will just kind of work itself out. Now, looking back, that's obviously too simple. But you spend at least half your life, most people anyway, buying rather simple arguments. And then the other half of your life wishing you hadn't done that. So if you want to know why the same person could rather reluctantly vote for Michael Dukakis on the one hand in 1988, and then in 1992 vote for George Bush Sr., well, that's why. I do remember thinking Dukakis in his helmet was pretty lame, but I think I did vote for him, as best I can recall. Look at that nameplate on his helmet. Now, my ideological conviction had been fading for about a decade. As I've gotten older, I've just sort of thought, I've come to the realization that there's no neat and tidy solutions. And I've been more and more attracted to classical Burkean conservatism as a result of that, because Burkean conservatism is a whole nother beast, and it involves acceptance of a fatally flawed humanity and the idea of incremental solutions and incremental change, and rejects the utopian vision that you can wave some sort of magic wand, in Friedman's case, the magic wand of free market economics, and everything will just become hunky-dory. Sorry, that means everything becomes right and okay. I started to realize that very slowly. I kind of came out of the fog, you might say, and realized that that type of conservative is really kind of radical and highly ideological, and isn't really conservative. There's a revolutionary character to it, and I started to develop some ideas about the connection between that type of conservatism and Enlightenment radicalism. I also began to be aware that these ideologies usually cover some more concrete agenda, that somebody behind the scenes is usually cleaning up while a whole lot of people run around doing their bidding because they are true believers in the ideology. And then in the last, 2 or 3 years, I've shifted my focus as I try to understand the things that are going on right now that are truly extraordinary in my view. You could argue that they are maybe one possible consequence of what came before them. Uh, but nevertheless, they strike me and a lot of other people as quite extraordinary, and complex and hard to understand. I was listening to Dan Carlin's podcast Common Sense. I listened to the last 3 or 4 episodes, and I think the last one he did was episode 318. And Dan Carlin, who's this great, historian, he's done all these wonderful, especially military history podcasts. Well, he's just discombobulated by what's been going on, and he's found it hard to do his podcast because he sincerely doesn't know exactly what's going on, and he very much doesn't know what, if anything, can be done about it. He's obviously very troubled by all these developments. I mean, if we take a step back, the whole war on terror must have something to do with the turn we've taken, the stress of being in constant war and far-flung war, and facing Islamic terror, and particularly the ISIS threat of late. ISIS is a very sophisticated organization that was very good at radicalizing and is very good in creating terror within its own population, and not just aimed at the West. Some of the things that they've done are just absolutely horrendous, and every bit as horrendous as anything you can imagine. So we live in a world in which we are at constant war, and our young people have grown up in that atmosphere, which is it's really different because it's so constant, and it's aimed not at our soldiers but at our at ordinary civilians and supposedly innocent people, and most of them are children, people who are in no way directly involved in doing anything. That's what makes it so terrifying. We've seen the rise of identity politics on the left and the right. The left went first with multiculturalism, and it was mainly centered on education, and particularly universities, and pushed pretty hard. And we won't belabor that. It's been thoroughly lampooned, I suppose, but it had its impact, and one of its impact was to stir. Is one of the reasons I think that right-wing identity politics has gotten started and has become attractive to people in the West. There's an increasing racial consciousness. We see a lot more open questioning of whether race determines character in a way, with the whole race realism debate. There's been a mainstreaming of the new right in a way that the far left never was quite mainstream. The far left is not CNN, obviously. But I think the far left could be mainstream now, because I think that there's this great openness that's arisen. People are very, very tired of what we've been doing for a long time, and this is what we need to untangle. But they're so tired of it that they're open to almost anything. So just as the new right is becoming mainstream, some of these ideas of the new right are being discussed openly and in mainstream publications and being debated, and more people are aware of those ideas, there's no reason why the far left couldn't be also in the mainstream. Everything's being shooken up. There's been an upsurge in domestic terror, in particular school shootings by young white males, and we're still debating whether to call it domestic terror. Just because there's no old-fashioned organization directly behind these acts does not make it some lone wolf crime. There's a pattern there, and yet our society is just determined to ignore it and to dither away in arguments about gun control and mental health. The left wing, and by this I mean at this point the Democratic Party, has displayed an incomprehension of the working class, even though they, for a long time, were the party of the working class. Reagan, pulled some working class people away, and that's how he got elected. So that was probably the beginning of that, right? There was this feeling that the Democrats took them for granted and kind of looked down on them, and that the people at the top of that party were elites. But that's a real thing, and I think that the latest example of that, which went over like a lead balloon, was Hillary Clinton calling Trump supporters deplorables. The reason why that statement resonated so much was because everybody kind of knew about that attitude for a long, long time. Another problem, there's a deep suspicion of information sources, and there's good reason for that. I don't think that the media had done the best job leading up to this and being truly objective. They made a lot of sound and fury about being objective, and I mean both CNN and Fox News and other left and right-wing outlets. They made a lot of noise about being objective, but they clearly weren't objective. You could see for decades that we were heading towards a more opinion-based and sort of soft journalism. Add to that people's feelings that educators were biased, and even scientists. Think about how people are urged to be respectful towards at least science, and yet who was it that sold us cigarettes and told us they were safe and wouldn't give us cancer? Well, I just asked that question because there are multiple episodes in our history where it's clear that science has not been objective and that where scientists have been wrong, and yet scientists never admit that. So at the same time, you have this deep suspicion of previously respected information sources. You get this huge upsurge in social media and a diffusion where people can, more or less if they want to, only hear what they want to hear or go down rabbit holes, and also feel like they are participating in politics when they're participating in something a little different. I'm not going to say they're not participating in anything, because social media has become a real instigator for new political movements and a sort of substitute for traditional organization. But it does make people feel like they're participating in a constructive way when they may simply be being led and not leading with their ideas. And of course, that's symbolized by the suspicion that Russia was manipulating social media so much that it sealed the deal for Donald Trump. And finally, and most prominently, we have a new kind of president here, and Donald Trump. He's a populist. I've mentioned before, he's pretty hard to pin down, but he campaigned on making fun of liberals and despising their elitism, on openly favoring the working class and people with less education, pulling the United States out of various obligations around the world of a military nature and also of an economic nature, withdrawal from some of these international economic agreements. He was not at all clearly free trade, quite the opposite. So his election tends to represent that part of our population that is tired of the effects of the globalized free trade, the supposed free market economy. But in his everyday actions, Trump is very confusing. He's very different. His style is very, very different. And there's a lot of upset people concerning his style. And it is true that he has a very different style, and it will change our expectations of how a president should act. But I'm afraid that people being too concerned about his style may lead them to not be able to see what's going on, what's actually being achieved during his presidency. So there's a lot of bread and circuses going on, and the news media definitely supports that. Not because it's some sort of, like conspiracy, but because it pays the bills. So anyway, all this is going on, and I'm thinking about all this and realizing that these ideologies, both of the left and the right wing that I had been involved in the past, neither one of them could really help out here. Neither one of them worked. They've actually been or in the process of being roundly rejected by an increasing number of highly skeptical and disgruntled people who know what they don't want, but may not know yet exactly what they do want. There's a lot of answers to what they should want, some of them more radical than others. But if my personal history is any indication, not to mention world history, especially of the 20th century, then most likely another ideology will gel and will attract adherents and initiate change. But what is that change, or what will it be? And will it promise to make everything all right? Will it promise the magic bullet again? One thing I can honestly say is people are really groping around for some kind of meaning and purpose. They want this identity that they feel they're lacking. They want to have meaning and purpose. And when people feel that way, they tend to congeal around a new or transformed ideology. Carl Jung understands this grasping, this sort of empty longing for meaning and identity, and he saw it in his own time in the fascist and Nazi movements as well as the communist movements before, during, and after World War II. I read his essay Wotan, and it's on my channel if you want to read it. Eventually I'll get to The Fight with the Shadow and After the Catastrophe, but those are 3 short works that he wrote that have directly to do with these mass movements and ideologies and their aftermath. He diagnosed all of them as what he called ideological possession. To do that, he had to build up his theory of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. And what I want to do next time, among other things, is just explain that theory a bit and how it relates to this, how they relate to this idea of ideological possession. Jung was different from Freud. He was a student of Freud's, but at a certain point, Freud got what we now call butthurt about the fact that Jung did not accept as gospel his theory of early childhood sexual experience, sort of, creating neuroses and things like that. The whole influence of sexuality was overblown, according to Jung, as he developed as a theorist himself, and he was of a more spiritual nature. In other words, he did acknowledge that sexuality is important, but mental illness, neuroses, not to mention very positive developments in one's life, in his view, had to do more with our spirit than with our sexual development. That's a gloss, and I'll have to explain it, but you can see that one theorist wouldn't be terribly open to discussing the dynamics and value of religion, whereas the other one would. If you ever wanted to learn more about Carl Jung, come back and listen next week. But also, even if you didn't want to know too much about him, come back if you're interested in trying to figure out what the heck is going on and what we can do about it. I'm not saying I have answers, but I'm actually kind of determined to sort through some things. I feel like I've developed some ideas that I need to sew together, and I'm going to try to do that this summer. Okay, see you next time. Bye.